Hello everyone, welcome back. Largest troop deaths in modern history. Putin's war is over. War has always left scars on history. But modern wars leave something even heavier behind. Numbers so large they stop feeling real. Columns of statistics. Silent rows of graves. Generations missing from census records. Mothers waiting for sons who will never return. In the 21st century, the world believed it had learned its lesson. Advanced diplomacy, global institutions, instant communication. These were supposed to prevent the kind of mass military deaths that defined the 20th century. Yet history did not end. It returned louder, bloodier, more public. When Russia invaded Ukraine, many thought it would be swift, surgical, decisive, a show of force followed by negotiations. That belief collapsed within weeks. What followed was not a limited operation, but a grinding industrial-scale war, one that now stands alongside the deadliest conflicts of modern history. This is not just the story of Ukraine. This is not just the story of Russia. This is the story of how modern warfare still consumes armies, and how one war may have quietly reached its end, not with victory, but with exhaustion. To understand why many now say Putin's war is over, we must first understand what modern history has already paid in blood. Modern history begins with the idea that war could be controlled, that technology would make conflict faster and cleaner. But the First World War shattered that illusion. Between 1914 and 1918, Europe turned into a slaughterhouse. Entire armies vanished in mud, filled trenches, machine guns cut down thousands in minutes, artillery shells fell day and night. Nations sent boys to the front and received silence in return. Russia alone lost millions of soldiers in World War I. Not only to bullets, but to hunger, disease, and chaos. The empire collapsed under the weight of those losses. The Romanovs fell. A revolution was born not from ideology alone, but from mass death. Germany lost an entire generation of men. France bled so deeply that some villages never recovered. Britain counted the dead by the tens of thousands from single battles. World War I ended not because someone won cleanly, but because everyone was broken. And still, the world did not learn. World War II would become the deadliest conflict in human history. It was not just a war between armies, but between entire societies. The Soviet Union suffered losses on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend today. Entire divisions were destroyed in weeks. Cities like Stalingrad became graves made of concrete and steel. Soldiers were sent into battle with minimal training, often without proper weapons, because the state believed survival was less important than resistance. Millions of Soviet soldiers died. Millions more were wounded or captured. The Red Army eventually pushed back Nazi Germany, but the victory came at an unimaginable cost. Germany's losses were catastrophic. Japan lost much of its military in the Pacific. The United States, though geographically distant, still paid with hundreds of thousands of lives. By 1945, modern war had proven one thing beyond doubt. Industrial states could destroy their own people faster than any enemy ever could. The promise after World War II was simple: never again, but never again did not last. The Cold War avoided direct conflict between superpowers, but proxy wars quietly produced mass troop deaths. The Korean War turned the peninsula into ruins. Chinese, North Korean, South Korean, and UN forces suffered enormous losses. Lines barely moved, but bodies piled up. Vietnam became a symbol of modern military failure. The United States lost tens of thousands of soldiers. Vietnamese military deaths were far higher. Jungle warfare, airstrikes, and attrition tactics created a war with no clear front and no clear victory. The Soviet Union would later face its own Vietnam and Afghanistan during the 1980s. What began as an intervention ended as a slow bleed. Soviet troops died in ambushes, helicopter crashes, and endless patrols. Morale collapsed. The war drained the economy. When the Soviet Union fell, Afghanistan was one of the wounds that never healed. Modern wars were supposed to be limited. Instead, they became prolonged, demoralizing, and politically destructive. And then came the 21st century. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the United States launched wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. These conflicts introduced a new kind of warfare: drones, precision strikes, counter-insurgency. While troop deaths were lower than world wars, the psychological cost was immense. Veterans returned with trauma. Civilian casualties destabilized entire regions. Governments fell, but peace never arrived. The lesson was clear: modern technology does not prevent death. It only changes how death is delivered. Still, few expected a large-scale conventional war in Europe again, until Ukraine. When Russian forces crossed into Ukraine, the world watched in disbelief. Tanks rolled across borders, missiles struck cities, infantry advanced along multiple fronts. At first, Moscow presented the invasion as limited, controlled, necessary, but the battlefield told a different story. Russian troops encountered fierce resistance. Ukrainian forces did not collapse. Supply lines failed. Communications broke down. Vehicles were abandoned. Soldiers were captured. What followed was not a lightning war, but a war of attrition. Artillery duels replaced rapid advances. Trenches returned to Europe. Drones hovered over battlefields like mechanical vultures. Each kilometer gained cost hundreds of lives. Casualties mounted. Unlike past wars, this one unfolded in real time on phones, on social media, on satellite images. The world watched soldiers die almost live. For Russia, the losses were shocking. Professional units were depleted. Elite formations suffered heavy casualties. Mobilized reservists were sent into combat with limited preparation. Equipment shortages became visible. Training camps filled with men who had never expected to fight. For Ukraine, the cost was also immense. Defending a nation demands sacrifice. Cities were destroyed. Families displaced. Soldiers died holding lines against overwhelming firepower. But the difference lay in motivation. Ukraine fought for survival. Russia fought for ambition. And history shows which side endures longer. As the war dragged on, comparisons began to appear. Military analysts quietly noted that Russian troop losses were approaching levels unseen since World War Roman II, especially when measured against the limited territorial gains. This was not a global war. This was not a fight against an existential enemy like Nazi Germany. This was a regional invasion with strategic goals that remained unclear even years later. The cost-benefit equation collapsed. Every modern army depends not just on numbers, but on morale. And morale does not survive endless funerals. Inside Russia, cracks appeared, recruitment struggled, families asked questions, silent dissent spread, not always in protests, but in absence. Men avoided mobilization. Borders filled with those trying to leave. The state could control media, but it could not control grief. Historically, wars do not always end with treaties. Some end with exhaustion. France in World War I did not surrender, but it could no longer attack. America in Vietnam did not lose every battle, but it lost the will to continue. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan did not collapse immediately, but it never recovered. This is the pattern modern history repeats. Wars become unsustainable not when armies are defeated, but when societies can no longer absorb the losses. Russia today faces that moment. The economy strains under sanctions. Military production struggles to replace destroyed equipment. Experienced officers are gone killed or wounded. Training cycles shrink. New units lack cohesion. Most importantly, the original objectives remain unmet. No decisive victory, no political resolution, no clear end, just numbers. When people say Putin's war is over, they do not mean the fighting has stopped. They mean the strategic outcome is already decided. A war meant to demonstrate strength has exposed limits. A campaign meant to intimidate neighbors has unified them. An invasion meant to reshape Europe has instead reshaped Russia. Even if the guns continue to fire, the war has already crossed the point of no return. Modern history shows that once troop deaths reach a certain scale, without decisive success, the war becomes a liability rather than a tool. At that stage, every additional loss weakens the state more than the enemy. Look back at the largest troop deaths in modern history, and a pattern emerges. World War I ended empires. World War Roman II ended illusions. Vietnam ended American confidence in limitless power. Afghanistan ended the Soviet Union's belief in control. Ukraine may not end Russia as a state, but it has already ended something just as important, the myth of effortless dominance. The war's legacy will not be measured only in territory, but in demographics, economics, and memory. Children who will never meet their fathers, cities that will take decades to rebuild, a generation shaped by loss. These are the true outcomes of modern war. In the end, the most dangerous thing about massive troop deaths is not the battlefield, it is what comes after. Societies carry trauma forward, politics radicalize, trust erodes, history does not reset after war. It compounds. That is why modern history's deadliest conflicts still echo today. And that is why this war, regardless of how it officially ends, will be studied not as a victory or defeat, but as a warning. A warning that even in the age of satellites and smart weapons, war remains the most expensive mistake a nation can make. And once the price is paid in blood, there are no refunds.